Welcome back. Very pleased to introduce our next panel, which is our first spotlight of the day. This is a one-on-one conversation called the ICO and Incident Response. And very grateful to be joined today by James Moss, who is the Director of Legal Services for Regulatory Enforcement at the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. James started at the ICO in January 2019 and has served in many capacities there, including acting general counsel. And he is joining us today from Manchester, England. James, can't wait to learn what you and the ICO are focused on now. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Bruce. It's going to be an interesting discussion, hopefully. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you. Also delighted to introduce our moderator today, Gail Crawford. Gail is a partner at Latham and Watkins, and she's global chair of that firm's data and technology transactions practice. And she helps navigate complex data privacy and security matters with her clients. In her practice, she handles some of the most complicated and sensitive data privacy matters in the global market. Gail is joining us today from London. Welcome, Gail. I'm very pleased to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Bruce, and thanks, James, for joining us. We've got about 23 minutes now of James's time, so I'm going to dive straight in. And really put myself in the shoes of a business, sort of asking and throwing out to James some of the challenges that we face. So we've been hit by a big incident, James. Backs are unfurling at speed, and we've got 24 hours to report. And that is a challenge that I think a lot of us as businesses and lawyers face. How does the ICO view that deadline, in that it can be quite difficult to really get around the facts and know whether you've got a reportable incident at that point, but businesses are increasingly worried they're going to get fined if they don't hit it. Is there any sort of tips or guidance you could give us as to how we should look at that?
Sure. So, I mean, we're really conscious that that's a tight timeline, and we're very comfortable with the fact that people are inevitably coming to us saying, look, we know something's happened, but at this point in time, we don't know quite what. And we are, we're familiar with and comfortable with getting that type of report and people saying to us, frankly, look, we're still working on this, we're looking into it, so we'll come back to you with more details in due course. So people shouldn't be worried about giving that type of response. I suppose, and we may come on to this in a bit more detail, the judgment call about do we know enough to know whether this is reportable or not is not always easy. Some cases it's straightforward and clearly, but there are some slightly trickier issues. So yeah, I think that's always a question, but inevitably as a regulator, what we would say is err on the side of caution. And I think from my perspective, certainly, we would rather hear about something and be able to say, having looked at it, actually, no, we're good, we don't need to do anything about that, than not hear about it, and then it comes to us much later. So we're not, I think, taking the view, be reticent. I think we're taking the view, if in doubt, tell us.
And that it could be, I guess, something's happened, we're still investigating, we'll update you as soon as we can, if that really is all you know, or all you know comfortably, and you think, you're sort of safe staying. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's basically it. And I mean, again, this might be something we touch on in due course, but if you look at the statistics of how many incidents are reported to us, as opposed to how many of those incidents end up needing a full investigation, it's a pretty small percentage. But again, we're familiar with that the statistics on that and the trends on that seem to be fairly static. The pandemic has actually pushed down the number of reported incidents by a fair amount. But my feel is it's probably going to be coming back up again to levels where it was in previous years, coming into next year, I suspect.
That's interesting. So do you think that's because people are not picking them up and reporting them, or do you think there are just less because, I don't know, there's less people in the office making human error that causes data breaches?
Difficult to say with any certainty. I think probably we'd be able to do a better crunch of the data once we've come out the other side, as it were. But, and this is perhaps interesting for people to know, that some of the incidents we see are technically and factually very complex, and they can be cyber incidents, hacking incidents, that type of thing. A lot of the incidents that are reported to us are, and I don't mean to kind of minimize the importance of these, but more low level. Improper use of BCC on emails continues to be a classic problem. And that's, people who are in this industry and work in this area know what problems can come from such a simple mistake, but we still see quite a lot of those. What we also see quite a lot of is people leaving physical copies of stuff in places they shouldn't be leaving it, or the really basic leaving your laptop on the train and it's not properly password protected and encrypted, for example, or leaving a USB stick somewhere with sensitive information on it. There's still an awful lot of that by sort of percentage volume is my feel for it, and anecdotally speaking to colleagues. So I wonder whether the fact that people aren't traveling as much and going to places has pushed down that type of incident.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Having thought about it, that's my suspicion on
yeah. Just looking at the list of questions, I don't know whether this is me or you, James. I think one of us mentioned 24 hours. We can confirm the deadline to report is 72. Whatever we said, yes. we didn't mean to change that.
Yes, I wasn't going to pick you up so early in the session on that, but no, quite right. It's 72. You can report earlier if you like.
And it's 72 from when you become sort of reasonably aware or aware with reasonable certainty. How do you look at that? I mean, presumably you need to know that data subjects are impacted at that point and there's some risk of harm.
No, absolutely. And that's what I was kind of referring to earlier, that sometimes it can be a tricky judgment call. And the law is not massively helpful on the detail of that because it just says, when you become aware. Again, people may be familiar already with the Article 29 Working Party Group guidance, which is a while ago now, but is still a pretty good benchmark, I think, which, as you say, you have to have, reasonable awareness. So the test in our view is not, you have to be absolutely certain that you've had an incident which impacts on personal data. So we don't. So, for example, if someone came to us and said, oh, well, this incident happened a month ago, but until today, or until within the last 72 hours, we weren't 100% sure, and therefore only reporting now, without, prejudging anything, because we don't do that, but wouldn't necessarily be massively impressed with that type of argument. But we appreciate it's a judgment call.
And what is the most important information that you want from people when they're reporting? If you had to sort of put your arms around sort of 5 data points that you're like, that's really the thrust of what I want to understand, what is that?
So our main concern as a regulator really is to protect people's rights and, prevent as far as possible privacy harms. And obviously the reason that data breaches are so critical and why the law requires them to be reported is so that when necessary, we can do something about that. So really the key thing, given we have an awful lot of these things reported to us constantly all the time, and that's fine, that's the job. But as I said earlier, the majority of them don't tend to require much, if any, further action. So what we're looking for as quickly as possible is enough information to effectively triage. So the sooner we can reach a clear factual understanding about, okay, how serious is this, which is predicated on, well, what sort of personal data are we actually talking about here? Is this sensitive, special category? Is it financial data that might expose people to fraud risk? Is it somebody's national insurance number? Is it their telephone number? What is it? That's really important, obviously, because the nature of the data helps us to calibrate the nature of the seriousness and the risk. Number of people affected is important. I know from past experience that's not always easy to get right precisely, either straight away or sometimes ever. There are cases I've worked on where it's really challenging to give a precise number. But even if, it's like, well, it's about 100 people or this could be 10 million people, that kind of understanding early on is important because that, again, helps us to calibrate risk, seriousness, triage our action on it. And those two things are important. I think also, what are you doing to try and fix it? That's important for us to understand because if something is almost if you like, a one-off, and what we're being told is we know this happened and it's finished, and we're confident we know what went wrong, or we're pretty confident we know, and it's not going to happen again. That's one thing. But if it's ongoing incident potentially, and we're being told we're not quite sure how this happened and it may still be happening, that requires perhaps more urgent engagement and intervention on our side. So those are the things that I think are really important to understand. And the overarching point I'd make is we want to be clear on the facts, and we want to have a clear, agreed understanding about what the facts are as soon as we can get to that. And it's only once we've got that we can take an informed decision about what we should be doing. So we're very keen on transparency, to borrow a term from elsewhere in our world, and frank engagements. And I appreciate, having spent more of my career on, I suppose, your side of the fence and this side of the fence, that lawyers are cautious and advisors are cautious, and there's sometimes a reluctance to tell the regulator certain things because of what the implications of that might be. And I get that. But equally, if we don't fully understand what's happened, then we're not really in a position to progress it. And we often spend a lot of time sort of getting to that understanding, and then that, the longer these things take to resolve, the more resource has to go into it on both sides, and the more sort of uncertainty there is generally about, well, where's this going to end up? So my view is, and my sort of ask always is, tell us everything you know and be as clear as possible about what's gone on. And then if we have to have an argument in due course about what should be done about that, fine, we'll have the argument, but let's get the facts clear first.
Yeah, I'm just watching the sort of questions come in. So someone said, what if it's high profile, a ransomware attack? I mean, as a lawyer, my view would be, well, you'd probably prefer her to hear from it from the business rather than in the press. So I guess there is a sort of pressure that way. But ultimately, I suspect it shouldn't really be triggering whether people report it to you within the 72 hours. That's a separate test.
No, absolutely. I mean, 72 hours is your awareness, not public awareness. And that's an interesting point, actually, because I suppose if you ask the question, where do we become aware of things? Often it's from stuff being reported directly, but it is also from the public domain and the press. And we have a very good and engaged external facing comms team and an intelligence team who keep a close eye on these things. So if we see a report of a significant data breach or a ransomware attack or something like that, there's processes in place to very quickly check in the other side of the office and go, have they reported this yet? Have we had anything? And if the answer's no, then we'll probably be reaching out and saying, well, is this right? And if it is right, are you thinking of reporting this to us? What's going on? Not immediately because we're prejudging the fact that you've breached a reporting requirement, but just because we know about it and it sounds like something we should know about and should be coming into us. So yeah, that we work that way as well.
And we've obviously got the sort of threshold to report. We have to report unless there's unlikely to be a risk of harm. Pretty low threshold in my view. I remember once reading about a report when I was doing diligence for a company where someone had reported someone looking over someone's shoulder, taking the address and sending them a Valentine's Day card because the person wasn't interested in the Valentine's Day card. Now, I suspect that's probably slightly below the threshold, but any guidance to people as to what unlikely to be risk of harm sort of means, or how they should approach that if they're not sure?
I think the best advice I could give would be approach it pragmatically and be prepared to justify it. Because there are things which, you're right, come below that threshold, and frankly, we're not very interested in millions or thousands of reports of that type of nature where there is realistically no likelihood of harm, and it's just a purely, if you like, technical matter. We don't publish prescriptive guidance on that where you fix that boundary, and deliberately so, because it's always a judgment call, it's always fact specific. So, if I was with my sort of advisor hat on the other side, what I'd be saying, and I've said this previously in other contexts, if you're going to take the decision to not report, then make sure you properly document the rationale for that. Because if it turns out, for example, to be worse than you initially thought, or something else happens, which means that it does need to be brought to our attention. And we're saying, well, why didn't you report it earlier? If somebody's saying to me, whether that's the lawyers or the DPO or whoever it is, well, this was our thinking at the time. This is what we knew. This was a factual basis. Our assessment was that there was no significant risk of harm, or it wasn't likely. And that's why, and here's our documentation of that. I'm probably going to be much more persuaded or impressed with that type of argument than something which is, just didn't think it was important. I mean, and I kind of exaggerate to make the point, but that's, I suppose, the best advice that I could give is if you're going to take that decision, fine, it's your judgment call, but make sure you document it and have a good reason for it.
So you seem to be having some sound problems, James. You probably can't see this.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's not your end, I don't think. I'm hoping folks can hear us, but I'm just going to sort of summarize what you said for anyone who's back on.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, there is that threshold, but it's a judgment call, it always is.
Yeah.
And actually, you should make that judgment call, applying your knowledge to everything you know and document it. And you will take that into account. We all know there's an element of sort of subjectivity, and there are some things that might be borderline, but you expect to see sort of sensible and accountable decision making around that.
Yes, that's a really good summary. And accountability, of course, is the buzzword and the key thing here, isn't it? Because that's baked into the way the system functions. I'm keen on, and I know colleagues are keen on, outcome-focused regulation. So, I'm certainly not in the business of being super punctilious about things. I'm in the business of doing the most work and focusing the most resource on the things which are most important. And that's calibrated by, well, what's the harm? Which of these incidents deserve most of our attention are the ones which are causing or is likely to cause the most harm to data subjects and UK citizens, etc. So that's the thinking that underpins it. So if people are thinking in that way, then they're thinking about it in the right way, I'd say.
And let's just put some of this into context. So you mentioned earlier, you obviously publish statistics in your regulatory report around the number of breaches you have and then how many go. Do you want to talk a bit about that? I mean, I seem to remember reading that the number that Progress defies is something like 0.1%. It's a very, very small percentage.
Yes, and I'm going to attempt to pull this up on my screen. So we publish an annual report, and the most recent one, it's on our website. It should be easily findable. But one of the metrics we do report on is personal data breaches. So, I mean, looking at the figures, 2021, 9,500, 1920, best part of 12,000. So that's kind of giving you a general high level number. And then of that, no further action breach recorded, 71.4%, investigation pursued 21.6%. So that gives you a rough idea of sort of how many we get and the split of those we end up investigating and those that we take no further action on. The number you're talking about is the number right at the bottom, which is action taken administrative fine. So that's obviously at the very end of it. So you can see that it's essentially a funnel. We get that many, and of those we investigate about 20-something%, and of those fewer end up being requiring administrative penalties, financial penalties, that kind of thing. So it's quite a steep funnel, if you like, but I think that's entirely appropriate. The way that the law is created, the threshold for reporting is low, as we were saying earlier, but that doesn't mean that we're going to take formal enforcement action on every single thing that's reported to us. That would be, just wouldn't work. You can imagine the size and scale of our action or our resource that would be needed to do that. But we're pragmatic about it, and a lot of things which are reported to us don't merit that level of action. It's useful though, and people have asked, well, shouldn't you just lobby government, or shouldn't Parliament massively raise the reporting threshold and reduce the burden on business? And well, that's not our decision, but I know those type of things are under discussion at the moment, which we're watching closely, obviously. But even if we don't take any formal action, breach reports are very useful for us in a wider sense, not just a particular sense of that one incident, because we aggregate them and we do work on them statistically. So enabling us to understand the trends and say, okay, well, we're getting a lot of reports where this is happening, or we're getting a lot of low-level reports from the same large organization and they seem to be having the same problem again and again and again. That triggers a different type of response. So that helps us do two things. Firstly, it allows us to think, okay, well, should we be focusing on doing more work on our guidance in this area? Because clearly lots of people are having problems with this, or it's going wrong a lot. So that's not specific action to one reporter about their breach, but that's more sort of, whole world industry wide, if you like, approach. And also what it allows us to do is kind of become aware of organizations which aren't necessarily having big major problems one off, if you like, but having lots of smaller problems consistently, because that may well prompt a different type of engagement.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And then I guess a sort of more practical question, useful for the audience, which is, so if you are in that 25 or so% where there is follow-up, what do you expect to see? So like, when I'm talking to clients, I'm saying, you need an incident response plan. The ICO will probably ask you for that. I hope that's right. But also you've got to show how you handled yourself and I guess complied with your incident response plan. And what do you expect to see to show that they actually followed it and implemented it? Do you need to see documents?
I mean, ideally, yes. The investigators and the caseworkers, I suppose, focused on getting what they need in a particular circumstances to understand the common factual position, as I was saying earlier. But yeah, documentation is good. Policies are only as good as their implementation. So, yes, if people are able to say, okay, look, we have written down and these are the steps and this is what we did and this, as you can see, this matches our incident response, then great. I think we'd be very happy with that type of thing. On occasion, we're interested in technical reports and IT reports. Depends on the nature of the breach, obviously. But if that's happening, often that will be very useful to us, because if the people who are coming to us to report something have brought in technical experts, whether they're in-house or external, to say, well, we've looked at this and this is actually what happened, that's particularly obviously applicable in cyber breach cases, ransomware type cases.
And what sort of weight do you put on bringing in a technical expert, a Mandiant or a Strauss and EY, some of the big four have got big arms?
I think, we leave that judgment call again to the organisation about whether they think it's necessary. But certainly from different cases I've worked on, there are things where you really do need somebody who's in that space, who's got that technical, whatever it is, cyber, computer security expertise to explain it in layman's terms to the investigators and the lawyers. I've been on various training courses to try and, to get a basic understanding of those concepts so that I at least know what the technical terms are and what on earth people are talking about. But I recognize expertise in an area when I see it, and I'm not purporting as a lawyer to have that cyber expertise and that information security expertise. So it's almost, if you see an incident and it's really obvious and you can easily explain what's happened to the ICO, great. But if you have an incident where you're thinking, I'm really not entirely sure, as the lawyer or the DPO or whoever it is, what's gone on here, I need somebody with a more technical background to break it down for me. And this comes back to the point about how confident are you that this is not going to happen again, or it's not still happening. If you need expertise to give that assurance, I think it's wise to go and get it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I guess just sort of rounding off, because we're coming to the end of our time, anything we haven't covered in terms of sort of tips for the audience? You've probably got about a minute, so I'm not sure you're going to get to do top 5, but top few tips.
Be frank and open with us. I have in the past done different jobs and appreciate the desire to be sort of tell the regulator as little as possible and kind of hope they don't guess the rest. And I understand that mindset, I suppose. I'm not going to massively criticize people for having that instinct. But my genuine experience is that the more frank the engagement is, the better it turns out and the quicker it gets sorted out. As I said earlier, we may end up having to, be in dispute about how serious we think this is and what should happen. And fine, we'll have the dispute, we'll have the argument. But the better and franker cooperation early on about what's gone on, in my experience, genuinely, the sooner it gets sorted. And that's better for everyone because, these things take time, money, resource. So the quicker you can draw a line under it, the better for everyone, I think.
Great. Well, thank you, James, for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about the sound issues and also the light issues. I've now got a halo on my head, which I didn't have at the start. But thank you very much. I hope that was useful. If we've got further questions, we will take a look at those. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Gail. Great job moderating. James, thank you so much for your participation and sharing your insights with this group. We really do appreciate it. We will be back with our next panel, which is on global incident response, managing incidents impacting global enterprises at 1:45. So we'll be right back.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining.